Hi, everyone. Welcome back to First Principles. Today we've got Samantha with us, and we'd be speaking about Montessori education. How are you doing, Samantha?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. For the purposes of this podcast, Samantha, could you introduce yourself to audiences?
Yeah, so I'm Samantha. I'm Samantha Joy on Twitter, and I've been a writer on Montessori and education for the past 2 years now, just past my 2 year anniversary, with Guidepost Montessori, which is the largest at this point in the world network of Montessori schools, birth through high school.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So let's dive right in then. What is Montessori education?
Yeah, so Montessori education, it's been around now for a bit over a century, and it's probably the biggest alternative
Hmm.
style of education in the world. And its fundamentals are uh, following the child, observing the child, and really designing um, your educational system based on developmental needs at
Okay.
each stage, and kind of thinking about what does a person need across life to become successful, to become happy. What are the tool sets, the attitudes, the knowledge that they need, and figuring out how to get that to them in a way that's engaging, self-motivated, that inspires their agency, their independence.
Okay. So I want to have some like pose some comparative questions to better understand this. So
Mhm.
let's start off with the regular, let's say, public education in the US and even internationally, public and private education. What is it like in your conception and what's wrong with it, if anything?
Well, I can speak more to public schools in the US.
Yeah.
My background is as a public school teacher. That was my first career. I did that for 4 or 5 years.
Right.
There's a lot that's wrong, I realized within my first year. I went in very naively.
Okay.
I loved school as a student, so I wasn't expecting it to be as challenging, I suppose, or as negative
Hmm.
uh, when I went in. But the major thing that's wrong with education or public schools in the US is that they treat children kind of as empty vessels
Hmm.
to fill with knowledge. And knowledge is great. Knowledge is important. You want to help children get knowledge. But they treat them as passive recipients rather than active agents who really need to be able to think and to get the knowledge independently and in order for it to be real to them to apply it.
Right. Right. But and that doesn't happen. It's mostly just passive and it's same for everyone.
Yeah, it's very one size fits all. You have to go through the curriculum at the same pace as everyone else in the classroom. And if, you're eager and ready to jump ahead, you're often told that you're a pest, you're a bother for the teacher
Hmm.
who, has 30 or however many students in class. And, if you're wanting to race ahead, they can't accommodate that, or at least they can't easily accommodate that. There are amazing teachers that really try to do that. So I don't want to give them short shrift, but it's very difficult. And I mean, same thing for the other end of the spectrum. If you're really struggling in a particular area and a particular concept, um, you have dates for the tests
Hmm.
and dates to pass through the curriculum. And if you're not keeping up, kind of sucks for you. You have to keep marching along in
Right.
lockstep with everyone.
Right. You sent me a few articles before when we decided to schedule this interview, and in one of them, you were talking about Maria Montessori and her experiments in like a neighborhood in Rome. Do you mind just walking us through that episode so that it can set better context?
Yeah, so Maria Montessori's first classroom was like a one-room classroom in the slums of Rome, a
Right.
really, really hard neighborhood. And she had, I mean, essentially 50-ish children in her classroom, all between the ages of 2 and 7-ish years old. Essentially, the children that are old enough to not be at their mother's side all day, but young enough to not be covered by traditional school.
Right.
And they were just running loose in this tenement and in this area because there was no one there to watch them,
Mm.
and really just causing a lot of damage to everything because they're children, they're running loose. There's nothing to do.
Yeah.
And the owners of the tenement, they contract out with Maria Montessori and say, like, we need somebody to do something with these children so that they stop damaging property.
Mm.
Can you teach them? She was already really well known at that time for other work that she had done, and so they reached out to her. And so she started this classroom. She had a teacher who was really just the daughter of the porter of the building.
Right.
And she had some toys and some of the learning materials that she had worked with and developed in her previous work. And I mean, she really approached it like a laboratory,
Mm.
in the sense that she would observe the children, she would take note of their behaviors, and then change things in the environment or change the way the teacher would interact with the children, and kind of note what changes that would bring about in the children. And so over time, she ended up discovering certain things about children's behavior that were that took her really by surprise,
Hmm.
that shocked her. And she was very skeptical of what she observed. And so she had to see it over and over and over again. So one example is, you think of a 3-4-year-old child, you think of somebody who's kind of bouncing off the walls. They have a lot of energy. They can't focus on any one thing. They're kind of just all over the place. And
Mm.
that was the perception of children at the time when Montessori was working. It's still pretty much the perception today. And she noticed on one occasion a child who was working on one of her learning materials. It's called the knob cylinder activity, and it's essentially a puzzle where you have to fit certain cylinders, go into certain slots. There's 10 of them, and they don't fit right. Then you notice at the end because you have one left over. And she saw this child who's probably around 3 years old, who was just lost in a state of flow,
Right.
just oblivious to the world around her. And, she would do the activity, she would finish. And instead of getting distracted, being dissatisfied, she would start over and she would do it again and again and again. And I think she did it around 40 times, this one activity. And Montessori is just so shocked by what she's seeing that she starts thinking, like, can I do something to get this child out of a state of flow? Like, how deep is this concentration? And so she gets all the other children in the classroom to start singing and dancing, making a huge commotion in the classroom. And no, child's still focusing. At one point, she describes picking the child up, chair and all, and she's grabbing the materials and still working on them. So this was one of the biggest shocks in the beginning of her work in that classroom.
Because of how locked in the child was.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Okay. And this is not expected, I'm assuming, from a lot of children at that age. That they're going to be
Certainly
in this.
not.
Hmm.
I mean, I feel like any parent, if you have a child who's 3, you're kind of just expecting them to be all over the place even
Right.
today. And it's not like this happens automatically, but she saw, I mean, what surprised her that they have this capability. It's not like the fact that children aren't normally like that isn't because they're just not capable of it. They are
Right.
capable of it if you find the right thing.
And what is the right thing in the right environment? And so what is the environment for Montessori schools they're trying to engineer? What are they trying to do?
It depends on what age we're looking at, but for the age of the children that she was working with, the thing that she discovered was the most likely to draw children in, to captivate them, was real world work,
Okay.
practical life skills, things that look mundane and boring to an adult, things like washing windows, dusting tables, preparing snack,
Hmm.
these very real world, practical things. Toddlers and young preschoolers, they're drawn to them. They want to do the things that they see their parents do, the
Right.
things that are connected to life that they can really see themselves achieving and becoming more independent.
It depends on the age you said. So okay, let me back up then. Is this mostly for preschool or is it straight through like K-12 and then university as well? Just going back.
So yeah, so Montessori, she, over the course of her career, she came up with a stage theory.
Right.
So developmental stages across time, and she came up with four of them. So the first one is 0 to 6 years. The next is 6 to 12, and there's always a little bit of flexibility. It's not a hard line, but then 12 to 18 and 18 to 24. And so what she's identifying in each of these stages is particular needs, particular interests, particular capabilities, even. And her project is designing education to fit that developmental stage, whichever one it is, to fit the needs and the interests that she identifies. And most of her work and her lifetime was with children 3 to 6 years old. So that the second half of the first developmental stage. She did some work in the first few years of elementary and some in the younger years as well, but a lot of that has been developed after her by other Montessorians.
And is there some kind of a way to say that this is like what she would have intended? Or you think people sort of go away from the original purpose as well when they're doing further developments to a system?
Yeah, I mean, I think in like I know less about the older years of Montessori and how it's applied, but she said less, for example, about middle and high school.
Hmm.
And so there are different interpretations and different routes that people go. So Montessori, her kind of vision that she laid out for high school that she didn't really like work out much in detail was that students should kind of be working on a farm.
Hmm.
They should be like helping with running a business, skills that they need. I mean, if you think of the time that she's in the early 20th century, like agriculture is still a big part of the modern economy for
Right.
her. And so she's thinking about how can they be contributing in a way that, isn't as high stakes as like go out and work, but is still getting that professional development, professional skills. And there are Montessori middle and high schools that have that farm model. I think there's one about an hour from me here in Michigan. But other schools like what we do at Guidepost, we have like a looser interpretation. And so like all of our middle school students, they start businesses
Hmm.
as a school. They might do different things as small groups. Some of them do like a lunch shop, a snack shop. Others, do things at art fairs with Etsy. Like there's a lot of different creativity, but still building in that professional skills aspect of education.
Okay. And so in the let's say you said that real life things, so I'm assuming concrete as well. But at what stage, and if at all, does abstraction come in? So like math and science and philosophy, if at all, or does that come in? How does that work?
Right. So in preschool in the year 3 to 6 is when we have our formal math curriculum starts and our formal language curriculum when we learn to read and to write. It's still very concrete, but it's at the very beginning where we're helping children form their first concepts in an
Hmm.
abstract form. We're building up towards abstraction. And then in elementary is where that really kind of blossoms, and we're really focused on history and science, especially history is kind of the unifying thing for all of the areas of the curriculum. So if we're studying a particular period in history, we're going to connect that to discoveries in science that we're talking about, discoveries in math that we're talking about. Like it's all kind of going to be wrapped around history in that way. But yeah, in preschool is when it starts, and it's one of my favorite parts of the Montessori approach is just how methodical the curriculum is in helping children form concepts in a way that's independent and precise, and that really builds a foundation for clear thinking later on.
I want to double click on all of these words that you used, right? So let's start with concept. So, and I don't know how else to phrase this question, but what is the concept of a concept in this scenario?
Right. So it's the idea that we have an idea that represents the essential of many different things. So a lion is both a lion that you could see in front of you, but it represents all the essential attributes of a lion that you might think of. It has a mane, it lives in a savanna in Africa, these kind of ideas.
Yeah.
And we're not really at that level quite in preschool, like where it's explained conceptually like that, but we're presenting concepts to children in a way that they can understand them concretely, that they can build an intuition for them without having to get an explanation verbally, because
Right.
they're not ready for that yet.
Okay. And then after the intuition stage, is there just going to be further sort of work in order to get the explanation and get the definition and then solidify that? Is that the track that's taken?
Right. So once they're in elementary, that is going to be like there's a lot more direct instruction and verbal, and reading books, for example, becomes a huge part of how they progress through the curriculum,
Right.
which they've been prepared for in the preschool because they have a really firm grasp on reading by that point.
Well, you mentioned clarity as well. So then what will be your definition of clarity in this context?
So in this context, it would be something like you know what makes something similar,
Right.
essentially similar, and what are the things that distinguish from
Hmm.
other things that are kind of similar but not the same. So can I give an example of
Yeah.
a particular material that we use in the preschool? It's called the geometric insets, and starting out, the very first one that they get has three geometrical figures. We have circle, square, and a triangle.
Hmm.
Those are very distinct from one another's shapes. We don't start with three different kinds of triangles or three different kinds of polygons. We do three that are very distinct from one another. It's very easy for the child when they're touching them, when they're doing the different activities with them, to get like squirrel or a circle is different from
Yeah.
a square, is different from a triangle. And we progressively move with these materials to ones that have differences that are less distinct. So they move on to, here's a set of three different triangles, and one's a right angle, one might be an equilateral triangle, and you're making the differences smaller as you go, and so you're really grasping, this is what makes a triangle a triangle. I know what it is in contrast to a circle, but
Right.
now I know what it is in contrast, like what a right angle triangle is in contrast to an equilateral, and that they're all triangles because they have it on a physical level. It's this, they can't say it's a three-sided shape with angles that all add to 180 degrees. They don't know it at that level, but they
Yeah.
know it on a tactile, intuitive level.
So is it safe to say that it starts with a tactile and then it becomes a little bit more intuitive and then it becomes abstract and then new knowledge can be produced? Or am I just putting words in your mouth? Is this the
I
right
think
trajectory?
I think that's a fair way to put it. Yeah, that
Right.
we're really starting concretely all five senses as much as we can,
Hmm.
helping them form, kind of a wordless estimation of what they're seeing.
Hmm.
And then at a certain point in the lesson, we do give them like the basic language. We'll tell them this is a triangle.
Right.
And for a child who's been like, maybe for days, weeks, working with these materials, like really grasping them on that physical level,
Right.
like getting the word is kind of like an explosion for them. It's like, I have a way to hold all of this information that I've been absorbing from the work I've been doing. It's
Right.
a triangle. It's something. I can hang my hat on it. It's a really exciting part of the learning process.
So this seems to me that there is a tremendous amount of integration going on because it's not just like a big sampling of you need to know these many things and they don't know what they mean to you and they don't know what they mean to each other. So is that the correct line? The
Yeah,
integration part?
yeah, I think so. I think that's the right way to think about it because everything in the Montessori classroom is connected in a certain way, and like the deeper you go, like the more you scratch under the surface, it's just kind of amazing how much thought was put into the curriculum.
Right.
So, as an example, like they're working with these hands-on materials that are puzzles that are interesting to them. And every single puzzle requires them, they have little knobs on them to pick them up by.
Hmm.
And the child has to pick them up using this particular hand grip that's the same hand grip that they'll use later on when they write.
Hmm.
And so they're building their hand coordination, their strength at the same time that they're doing something completely unrelated.
Right.
Or, for example, everything in the Montessori classroom is, on the shelf, it's organized very particularly, left to right, top to bottom. The easiest material is always on the top, at the left, and as you go. And so this is the same in English, at least, as you read. Like
Hmm.
it's building that structure, that flow, that logic into the physical environment because Montessori's whole view is that children absorb knowledge from the environment. They absorb information about the world, and it's preparing them.
I think that was quite profound. If you can speak a little bit more to that, like absorbing things on their own from the environment, is that not commonly held in the mainstream culture?
No, I think it is in a particular sense, right? We all talk about how children, they absorb things like a sponge
Yeah,
and they hear something once on TV and then suddenly they're repeating it. So
yeah,
I think that idea is in the air. What's unique about Montessori is the level of seriousness I think she takes with that and how much thought then she's putting into this very curated environment and what exactly we're trying to do with it, what we're trying to help them absorb.
right.
So I think people do recognize that, but it's hard to see at what level, I guess, how much that is true and how many levers there are for you to pull, because there really are a lot.
Okay. And can you speak to the independence and developing independence part as well? Because that was really intriguing to me.
Yeah, so that, I mean, it's a really core part of Montessori, developing independence. You could even put it as like the core goal,
Hmm.
because Montessori is, she's thinking about education in terms of human life. How do
Hmm.
we help life develop? Similar to how like you might think about growing plants. Like there are certain nutrients and sunlight and water. There are these needs that life has to develop well. And so she's thinking in the same way, but about children and about education. And one day they're going to be independent adults living their own life. And
Hmm.
and if you observe children closely, even young babies, you notice that they're striving for independence in particular ways. You notice the baby who wants to stretch and crawl and walk and wants to achieve certain things.
Right.
Or the most obvious is once they get to the toddler stage and they will tell you, I want to do this myself. Leave me alone. Let
Yeah.
me do it. And they're fighting often their parents and their teachers to get to do things themselves. And so much of the Montessori approach is about, how do we make life accessible to children? How do we make it, safe for them to be able to try and do these things themselves? And then how do we give them the support so that they can actually be successful? So, her first classroom, her preschool was called Casa dei Bambini, which is children's house.
Hmm.
So it was designed to be a house that's actually meant to fit for a child. So furniture that is the child size, brooms, dustpans, mops, all of these things are at the child size. Things are at the child's level so that they can reach it. Even things like artwork
Hmm.
or posters. Like in a normal classroom, you walk in and everything's up high from an adult's point of view, and everything in Montessori is down low, even for babies, like really low to the ground so that they can see it. Um, so everything is kind of being centered on this idea of giving children access to the world to be independent. Um, Not like an expectation that you must be independent whether you like it or not,
Yeah.
which is sometimes how Montessori is cast. But it's more about inspiring, and it's just such a natural thing that children want. It doesn't have to be forced onto them. And if you provide them the right guidance and support, they'll naturally want to do it. And these are just giving the tools so that they can.
So the independence here is essentially, I'm just trying to get a conception of that in my head. It's like dealing with the world in an independent and unique way and having the confidence to do that, or developing the confidence to do that. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, I mean, think about it this way. The day in the life of a baby, a young toddler, like so much of your day is people doing things to
For you.
you.
Yeah.
They are changing your diaper, they're putting food in your mouth, they're picking you up and taking you other places. Like you feel yourself being acted upon. And so Montessori is about helping them feel like agents,
Hmm.
like actors in their own life, authors of their own life.
Yeah.
And it really is something that builds a lot of confidence and self-esteem. Like a toddler who can zip his own coat is a toddler who feels like I can do things myself. I can take care of myself. I can meet my needs. I am like the adult. I can do something just like these people who are giants to me
Right.
can
Right. Right.
do. And so it's a real confidence boost. It's a real connection to self-esteem. If you think about like self-esteem as being like proving to yourself that you can handle life. And every single activity where you're doing this practical real world work is like a real proof to yourself that I can handle life. I can do things.
Right. So I'm assuming that kids who have developed that kind of self-esteem later on, it's not going to be like easy to, they would not be like compelled by hazing and bullying, and also they would not be subject to it as well as much, because there is there's something going on with self-esteem with, those kind of things come in. So are there any comparative studies on that, or anecdotally has anything been observed in Montessori schools where there's less rate of bullying?
Yeah, I don't know about any studies that look into that in particular.
Hmm.
But I would think that they would be less immune to things like that. And I mean, I can speak to what the social environment is like in a Montessori classroom,
Yeah.
because I do think, in fact, there's less of the bullying or peer pressure, competition in a negative sense that you might see in a regular traditional conventional classroom. And part of it is because you aren't in lockstep with one another.
Hmm.
Everybody's at a different place in the curriculum. Nobody's causing you to have to go slower than you'd like, or forcing you to go faster than you'd like. Nobody is, commandeering the teacher, because everybody's at a different place. Everybody's going through the curriculum at their own pace. So it takes a lot of pressure and competition off. It's just normal in a Montessori classroom
Hmm.
for everybody to be at a different place. Some people, you might be in an elementary classroom already doing middle school math, but maybe, you're not as far in reading and you're doing lower level reading. Like that's just normal. It's
Yeah.
not, there's no skipping grades or something like that. It's like everybody's just at the curriculum in their own place. But another thing about the social environment is that every Montessori classroom is mixed age.
Hmm.
So there's a wide band in the older years, like from preschool through high school. The age bands are usually 3 years. So 3 to 6, yeah, six
Ah.
to nine, 9 to 12. Sometimes it can even be bigger, it can be a 6 year gap, depending on how small the school is.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so you have not only is like everybody who's your own age at a different spot, in the curriculum, but you have younger and older kids in the class. And so, the younger kids, they get this experience kind of like having an older sibling in a certain sense. Like, I want to be like the older kids. We see this, for example, like in our toddler classrooms. The older kids, they're independent going to the bathroom,
Hmm.
and the younger kids are like, I want to be like that. It can be a real boost for development. And then the older kids, they get the experience of being the leaders. They're the oldest kids in the class.
Yeah.
They know all the routines. And, we often have particular, routines in the class where we might have, you can be a buddy to the new kids that are starting. You're assigned a particular kid that you get to mentor in their first week or so of school. And so you're building that camaraderie from
Yeah.
the very beginning.
It makes sense. I mean, it's rare that you find everybody, like apart from schools, like everybody's 14 years old and everybody's 16 years old. It's weird. Yeah.
Right. It's unnatural.
Yeah. Okay. The apprenticeship aspects of it. So like when the older kids are mentoring the younger kids. Now I'm just concerned because, well, in my I guess, conception of things, that there can be like opportunities to sort of exploit that. You're weaker, you're smaller, you're younger. So does that happen? And if yes, then what are the preventative steps for making sure that that kind of dynamic doesn't play out?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it would never happen, right? Kids are, they're learning how to behave appropriately in a social environment. So
Yeah.
they're going to experiment and need to be guided. Um, but I'll talk about the elementary classroom where I think that's going to would show up if it's going to show up more
Yeah.
often. And, we have particular curriculum around helping like navigate conflicts and in a healthy way and to communicate effectively needs and things like that. So we have, for example, what's called the Montessori Peace Table, where we're going to have a conference where like you have the two students who are perhaps are having a conflict on opposite sides, and the teacher's going to essentially like guide them through an exercise where we're going to listen to what this person has to say. We'll respond, and we'll kind of like come together in a to figure out a way that meets both of our needs without impinging upon one another, because we want to have a foundation of respect in the classroom.
So then that takes me to what's the role of the teacher here, and are they more like guides?
Yeah, I think that often guide is the right way to think about it. I mean, where I work, we call our teachers guides.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes I hesitate to use that because I think it gives the impression too often that direct instruction is not a thing in the Montessori classroom, when it is. Direct
Okay.
instruction is a thing. It's more that our view is that education doesn't mean the teacher fills a child who is passive, fills their mind, they're an empty vessel. The teacher is active, they're doing a lot of different things. Instruction is one piece of what they're doing,
Hmm.
and preparing the environment is another piece, because we consider that to be a really important component of teaching. And then inspiring and redirecting and supporting the child is in a large part of their education being really independent and taking ownership over their education. So I would say the role is kind of broader
Hmm.
than a traditional teacher, rather than completely different or opposed to it.
So you do have subject matter expert teachers with like the chalkboard and giving a direct instruction. And if yes, then how is it different from like regular schools?
There wouldn't be like a chalkboard in front of the whole class.
Okay.
So the instructional ratio is always going to be quite a bit smaller than a normal conventional classroom. So in elementary, it'll be small groups. Like you might have a group of 2 to 4 students who are around, the same place in a particular area of the curriculum, and you'll give them a lesson, you'll have materials, maybe a book, something, a game or an activity that you're doing together. And
Hmm.
then the lesson's short. It's not going to take all day. It might be 20 minutes that you're working together. And then you're giving particular kind of follow-up
Right.
work for the child to do on their own independently or in a small group. In elementary, they often want to be working in groups. And, providing avenues for children who become inspired to be able to go deeper if they want to. So there's a minimum that we want everybody to have in every subject, but we want to provide these, routes that children can go if they want, if they get particularly inspired by something, to go really deep, to do a project, to do research, not assigned. It's completely their own choice, and everybody will be doing something different throughout the year. But so they're getting kind of all different instructional modes, and that in elementary.
So they're having that the breadth of experience as well as depth if they want to in a particular area of where they're interested in.
Exactly.
Okay. I have a lot of questions about that though. So let's say somebody is not interested in certain aspects that you think you must cover. So what are the methods, or I don't know, what's the philosophy behind motivating a child to, explore that area as well?
Right. So, I mean, a couple of things to say there. One is that we don't treat that as the end of the story.
Okay.
Or at least properly, we shouldn't treat that as the end of the story. If a child says, "Yeah, I don't care about math," or "I don't want to learn history," like that's something serious that we want to think about. How do we reach that child? How do we inspire them? How do we make this something that they really want to explore? But we don't just say, "Oh, well, I guess that's your choice, and we care about independence, so I guess you don't have to learn math." So that's not the approach.
Okay.
And it's gonna be really individualized. But the core thing, especially in elementary, is invoking curiosity. So it's often not something that looks more superficial, like, I know he's really into soccer. So if I can just give him math problems about soccer, then that's the way to reach him. Like, that might be helpful in the moment. I'm not saying that you should never do something like that, but we're often trying to think, what kind of question could I ask that could make him curious about this thing. And curiosity is often in elementary what you want to tap into, because they are at the stage where they can explore things intellectually, and they will if they're given that motivation. I have a 9-year-old here in my house, my stepson, and he's exactly like that. He asks just these amazing questions all the time. And if you ask him the right question when he's in the right mood, you can really get him to explore different areas of interest. And so that's kind of like the basic approach that we're thinking about.
Okay, you mentioned a word, and now I have to double click on that as well. Mood. How do you tackle with that, the emotional states? Because children can be moody. I mean, I'm moody. I'm not a child anymore. But so what happens there?
Yeah, it depends on the particular child, but we do see like helping children with like emotional challenges as part of the scope
of
education.
the scope.
Yeah. And so, in the younger years, we have a whole curriculum. It's called Grace and Courtesy. And we're going to work proactively to help avoid some of like the big emotions that might happen in toddler, let's say, and give them strategies to deal with things. But, some kids need different things in the moment when they are in a mood. Some kids, like, they want hugs. Other ones, like, I just need you to leave me alone for a little bit. And so it's going to be really tailored to the child in that way. But it is something that like we're thinking about. How can we reach this child and give them the skills that they need? Maybe the language, like for a toddler, be able to say, "I need space." Instead of hitting, instead of biting, for example, they needed the words. And so, we're going to observe them really closely and figure out, is that the issue right here? Is that what's going on? And give them that tool set to handle it.
So this looks like a very active, discerning work that a teacher would need to do almost on a daily basis. It cannot be just rinse and repeat. What's the training for the teachers like here, especially if they've not gone through Montessori education?
Right. Yeah. I think that that's really perceptive because it is. The Montessori teacher's role is incredibly active. You have to be very observation focused, very detail oriented
Hmm.
in the way that you're approaching children. Our, at Guidepost, we have our own teacher training program, and it's kind of integrated into their work as a teacher. So we give it to them for free, and as part of their day, they're attending classes. They're going to in-person seminars where we're all working on the materials, and they're getting practice every day in the observation and talking to their instructors about problems that they're having in their classroom or challenges and how do you deal with this. And I think it's a really great model for teacher training because, well, I can speak to it because I was a trained teacher in the conventional model, and
Hmm.
you spend 4 years in university classrooms, and maybe you have some observation that you're required to do, but it's you're not doing anything, so it's not the same thing, and then you're thrown into student teaching,
Yeah.
thrown into a classroom for the first time and said, good luck, go do it. And
Yeah.
it's a very sink or swim kind of phenomenon.
Oh, okay. So there's no active sort of support there for the teachers in the regular scenario.
Not as much. No, I mean, certain programs perhaps might be different. I don't want
Right,
to
right.
overgeneralize, but certainly in my experience.
Okay. So getting back to the depth and the breadth. Now we've addressed the breadth. What about the depth? Like if you do you notice in your opinion or in your observation, is almost every child interested in something deeply and they pursue it, or they need to be nudged there as well? You just want to do things at the surface level. Like, is that a problem that comes up?
I do think it's a problem that comes up. Like it's something we have to think about and think through.
Hmm.
Though, um, I mean, children, especially in elementary, are eager to go deep into topics, but every child has different personality or different backgrounds. There can be challenges with that. Um, but yeah, in general, there are subjects that, they just capture their imagination and then they can't get enough of it.
Right.
Um, there
Right.
was, we interviewed a student a few months ago. I don't know, she's 10 or 11. And she was just so into the planets and the stars and was going super deep learning,
Right.
reading lots of books that, weren't required for her to read. Like she just had, a lesson on something about the planets, and she just took that and ran with it.
Hmm.
Other kids, it might be animals are often really popular, classification schemes, history, particular words, things like that
Right.
can be really inspiring to certain kids.
You said history is like a connective tissue, especially in the elementary and preschool stage. Sorry if I'm misquoting you, but like, why history? Why is it so important as a connector?
Yeah, I mean, it part of the reason why is that when you're teaching math
Hmm.
in the usual way, like you aren't understanding like what is the relevance of this? What does this have to do with
Yeah.
anything? And if you're learning everything through the lens of history and specifically through the lens of people accomplishing things,
Right.
people achieving things, people having to overcome amazing difficulties to get their ideas heard, to understand things for the very first time, often dying, like uh, uh, for holding on to a view that is unpopular at the time. Like everything that you learn then is becomes charged with that energy and that excitement. So that's one reason why history is kind of the connective tissue. But also it helps put into context um, like where we're at in modern times, and it just helps give a new perspective on progress and what's possible for you.
Hmm.
Like if you're learning about what people are accomplishing throughout time and how much has changed, and you're also experiencing it in small ways throughout the classroom because you are given independence and you are doing more practical work. Like it's really building this optimistic sense of the future and of yourself in the future. I feel like so often kids reach high school, and I mean, I experienced this as a teacher. It was one of the most deeply tragic things that I experienced was even you have like the brightest students you love to have in class that are always answering questions, and they're anxious and scared about the future,
Yeah.
their future. They don't know what they want to do, and they're scared about having to think about it and about, taking that step to go out on their own. And, that, I don't know, it broke my heart when I experienced that, when like even the top students are just like they feel unprepared. And so I think there's a lot that goes into that, but one of the things that Montessori is doing is helping build that sense of optimism for the future,
Hmm.
partly through studying history.
So is it safe to say then it's the part of the meta learning is that the world is not going to happen to you where you are just like a non-playing character. You can be an active participant, change it to your will, and then that's getting imparted. So inherently, it's going to be more optimistic than just being a nihilist,
Right.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow,
I
that's very
mean,
important.
yeah, I mean their entire experience of school is I am an agent who does things.
Hmm. Hmm.
I learn things, I build things, I achieve things, I make friends. Like everything is very active and uh, an independent experience of yourself and your life. And that's not something that you often get
Yeah, yeah,
in,
yeah.
in conventional schooling. I certainly didn't.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess if you just go around as like a below average student in a conventional schooling, even if it's like, high status, you have these posh boarding schools and all that. Sometimes that's the best that can happen to somebody because otherwise, you get noticed too much and that becomes a problem. Okay. Do you have an opinion on pedagogy? Do you think it's like a precise science or is it still like a bunch of heuristics and we are still figuring out what the best way to impart knowledge is?
I mean, I think there's so much to figure out. But I do in essence believe that it's a science so that it can be figured out,
Hmm,
and the root is observation. I mean, that was Montessori's approach,
right.
which was revolutionary at the time. It's still radical, I think, today, that you can figure out the best way to present particular things that reaches every child, because it's designed for where they're at developmentally.
And then coming to that, what's the ideal? Well, I have to use the standard term class size here.
Ooh, that's such an interesting question because people often think that class sizes should be really small, and Montessori kind of bucks the trend here. Like our ideal class size is going to be larger than the conventional. We like in a preschool, we would think it'd be great to have a class of 30
Hmm,
children, which most parents, if they'd see that, or most educators would see that, and they would balk. And because part of it you have to think about, that doesn't mean 34-year-olds. It means you have, 10 3-year-olds, maybe
right.
10 4-year-olds, 10 5-year-olds. And so you're having people across the developmental stage. But we just find that the bigger class size, it just provides so much social benefit. Um, Part of it is, having the people to look up to, being at different stages, having different things to work on. Um, but the instructional ratio is smaller than
Hmm,
most classes because in Children's House and preschool and kindergarten, the instructional ratio is pretty much always one-on-one. The
right.
teacher is always working one-on-one. So even though you have a bigger class size overall, the teaching is happening at a smaller level. And then in elementary, it gets a little bit, there's still some one-on-one instruction, but it's often small group, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids at a time, depending on the lesson.
So that's almost like hiring a private tutor for your kid. And I mean, I grew up in like India, which is it has a big exam culture. So I mean, I was always under some private tuition since I think class two, and we call it class, not grade, but yeah. So is it like that? I mean, that happening as well as what happens in a class then if the instructions are smaller like that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because it is kind of a head scratcher if you're thinking from a conventional
Yeah.
like a schooling. But I mean, essentially the way it works is, we have a curriculum that is able to be navigated independently. So once the teacher shows you how to
Hmm.
use a certain activity or a certain material, you as the child can select it
Hmm.
and go to work at it by yourself. And the material is designed so that it can tell you by the way that you're using it, whether you're figuring it out or not, whether you're doing it right. So you
Right.
don't need to have the teacher right there saying, A plus, B minus, you're not doing this right, you're doing this wrong. The,
Hmm.
the material itself is telling you. In Montessori, we call it control of error. So the materials are able to be used independently.
Right.
And then you have an entire approach that's been focused on building focus and independence.
Hmm.
So you have children who are used to being able to choose for themselves, who are used to sitting down and focusing for long periods on the material and not being interrupted by anyone. So they've built that capacity.
Hmm.
And so the teacher, they're spending their time kind of from going from student to student, wandering around the classroom, observing, finding a child who, maybe they're ready for the next lesson and sitting with them for a while, showing them, and then leaving, letting them focus on this new activity and then finding the next child. And so it's kind of this rotating mentor in the classroom, this rotating guide who is helping individual children while the other children are working on their own.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question, but I need to set it up from where I'm coming from. Um,
Uh-huh.
the question is, how do you avoid status jockeying and then things like that? And the reason I ask is like in some of the schools where I grew up, they have classes, so every age has a class, has a grade, and then there are sections which from A to Z. And then all the smart kids go in A and B and C, and everybody who is average or dumb in there, whatever, goes in the low. So this obviously brings a lot of like it kills your self-respect, obviously. And then there is other kids making fun of you, all of those. How is all that tackled at all? Or does it not even show up?
Right. So I mean, some of this was what I was mentioning earlier with the 3-year age
Yeah, yeah,
band. So it's normal to not be at the same place as anyone else. So
right.
there's never this experience of I'm behind or I'm ahead
Yeah, you
because
failed the class.
yeah, exactly. Like, how do you even judge that?
Right.
Um, and part of it too is that we have so much flexibility because of that, that we can bring materials and curriculum
Right.
that are advanced to you.
Mm.
So sometimes, our toddlers, they might not be toilet trained yet, but they're ready to learn to read.
Mm.
Well, we can bring the materials from the children's house, from the preschool,
Right.
and they can get that intellectual satisfaction. And same thing, all the way through all the ages.
Yeah.
If you're an elementary student and you're ready for middle school math, well, everybody's kind of got their own schedule doing their own thing. You can go for an hour and connect, like in our schools, to the virtual middle school math program. You can get that lesson for half hour, an hour.
Mm.
Nobody is thinking like, oh, where's Henry going? Why is he getting this special lesson? Because they're busy doing their own things. I don't like
Yes.
it's like everybody's kind of at their own pace, and they're not so laser focused on everyone else because they're not in lockstep. Like they don't have to be laser focused on everyone else.
Yeah. They're not looking at each other. They're essentially looking at the task that they want to do. And that brings out a sense of now okay, that brings me to this kind of independence could be scary to people who are more, let's say, traditional or used to a more command and control structure, whether in the workplace or at home or so what happens, how are parents coached and how are kids sort of trained to go to university and work in the real world? Silicon Valley is different, but if you're in a factory, that becomes a problem.
Right. I mean, the question where this often comes up with parents is, at some point they're going to move on to a different kind of school.
Yeah.
Maybe they're going to go from kindergarten to the public elementary school,
Hmm.
or they're going to go from the elementary school to the public um, high school. And they're worried, like, what is that transition going to look like? Are they going to be able to get used to
Yeah.
being told what to do all the time? And like any transition for any kid is just, it's a challenge. Like for a little while, like it's going to be kind of weird.
Hmm.
But I mean, we just find that they do transition fine when they move to a more structured environment like that. I'm not going to say that they're in love with it, but the kids who are already there being told what to do every day don't
Yeah.
love it either.
Yeah.
So it's not different in that sense. And then as far as when they're transitioning to adulthood, they're better prepared. Like when you go to college,
Hmm.
nobody's like on your shoulder telling you, you better go to class today. Are
Yeah.
you studying for the test that's in 2 weeks? Nobody's there doing that. And the kids that have gone through conventional program where their entire day is scheduled in 15-minute blocks and a bell tells you when you're supposed to get up from your desk
Oh,
and
the bell.
you have to ask a teacher if you're even allowed to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Like it's that is scary for them because they've never had that freedom to design their own day.
Yeah.
And so they're often better prepared because they have had that experience in a lower stakes way and with a lot of support and structure to build up the skills to be able to do that,
Hmm.
to make that change in the future.
But I mean, it's just, we should just say it, like, building children to be proper, well-formed human beings who are more independent-minded, and they will need that. They're not going to be happy just with, taking orders. So then that's okay, I suppose, you know? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the bells and everything and asking permission to use the toilet, I mean, you're preparing them for prison, not for the real life. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's
When it comes to exams, I have a slightly cynical theory on exams. I think, yes, you might be testing for ability in a certain way, but I've been to enough prep classes again in India where the focus is not really about what you know and how you know. And the focus is you need to pass this. That's the focus. So what you're doing essentially is willfully getting into the examiner's frame and trying to impress them somehow, doing the right things. And then that's it. Doesn't matter if you understand the subject or not. So how much do you agree or disagree with this assessment, and how are examinations and tests looked at in the Montessori system?
yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how much, I haven't thought a lot about whether I agree with that in general about tests. I mean, I think there's a lot to that.
Hmm.
That's true. But from a teacher's perspective, we want assessment. We want to have the pulse on what you understand.
Yeah.
And so, in elementary and above, we do use formal and informal assessments, at least in our schools.
Hmm.
We do. Although it's not like a high pressure, high stakes kind of thing. It is much more of like, here's another tool we can use in addition to all the other observation and work that you're doing in the classroom to kind of help me, the teacher,
Hmm.
decide what I'm going to do next. So
Right.
it's like it's important as a way of helping the teacher plan their day and not so much like this is who you, the student, who you are.
Hmm.
I've assigned the grade. This is the kind of person you are now for eternity. And then, in high school and middle school in our programs, we have, for example, like if a student, their goal is they want to become a doctor, they want to become an engineer, and they want to go to university. Like one of the steps to doing that is, maybe taking the SAT or some other college readiness exam. And so we'll build that into, how we're working with that particular student.
Hmm.
And like it's a very like self-chosen goal at that point. It's not something that's like everybody has to do this. And it's just imposed on you. It's like you've chosen this goal, and now we're going to help you, break that into pieces across, your time in high school or across the year that you're with us to
Yeah.
to meet the goal that you want.
Right, right. You've chosen this goal as an important thing, because again, this is going to be new, but a lot of there are still arranged marriages that happen, in a lot of parts of the world, and a lot of
Yeah.
folks, when given the option, you should be able to marry who you want. Like, duh, they're like, no, I want you to choose a mate for me, a partner for me, because if something goes wrong, I'll have someone to blame. And I'm like, oh
Mm.
God, really? You gonna live like that just because of that? So yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally resonate with that. Okay. In
The
the
safe choice in one sense and not in another.
Well, maybe safe, but very uncomfortable, like
Yes.
that. I mean, I don't know. I rather choose my own follies, but anyway.
Yes.
Okay. In the last section, I came across, I mean, I knew what Montessori was, but my interest sort of ignited again when I read, and I'm going to butcher the name, Ayn Rand's essay, The Complachicos, I think.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, so you know about it. And there she's talking about progressive education and essentially getting your sense of what's right and what's wrong from other people. And that's always an amorphous group. Could you speak to that a little bit? Like what's right with it, what's wrong with it, if anything? Like what do you think, and how is Montessori different?
Different from the progressives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, very different in my view, though Montessori often gets lumped in
Hmm.
with progressive or progressive styles of education. I mean, in reality, both the traditionalists and the progressive camps broadly try to say Montessori is one or the other. So
Right.
progressives often criticize Montessori, saying that the approach is way too structured. You're telling kids what they have to learn and that they have to use materials in a particular way. Like you're just as bad as the traditionalists.
Hmm.
And then the traditionalists are looking at Montessori and saying, what? The children have freedom and they can choose what to work on. Like, what is this insanity? You're progressive. And so you have both of these camps are essentially saying there's only two options. We are the two options, and Montessori is the other one.
Hmm.
But my view is that Montessori is orthogonal or perpendicular to both of those camps. I think they go wrong in different ways. Um, but the way that Montessori is different from the progressive camp, let's say, is that they treat knowledge, Montessori treats knowledge as a serious achievement,
Right.
that it requires real thought and effort. It doesn't just happen with a child, just discovering or going about the world. Like they can learn things
Hmm.
that way, but there will often be gaps and misunderstandings and confusions. And if you're not, helping guide that process, like the Montessori view is that that's negligent, like
Yeah.
that's not education. And then for in opposition to the traditionalists, Montessori views knowledge as independent. Like
Hmm.
it's knowledge is only something an individual can have. You either understand it real for yourself or you don't understand it. And maybe you can get a child to repeat and mimic after you, but they can't apply it, they can't integrate it, they can't interrelate it with other things.
Right.
Like that's not real knowledge. And so Montessori in that way is opposed to both of those camps for different reasons. But yeah.
So it's not right because the authority says so. It's not right because the collective says so. It's right because if it makes sense to you and you make the effort to integrate it in your own mind. Is that the line?
Yeah, yeah, knowledge is what accords with reality, and
Right.
only you, the individual, can assess that for yourself. Or like, it's not knowledge unless it's knowledge to you.
Right. Right. Yeah, I can see why both these camps are, like
Up
scary,
in
scared.
arms.
Yeah, because it's like the collectivist here and the collectivist here, and you're creating individuals here, and that's scary to people. So that's anyway. That's my reading. But this is good. Okay. Um, in the like a few last questions. So in the you said there are sort of theories and recommendations till up to even for young adults till about age 24. What about afterwards? What are people who have grown and now they want some kind of a remedial education? What can we do?
That's such a good, interesting question. There isn't like that I know of. Maybe this should be a startup, a Montessori for the
Yeah.
adult, the remedial education. I mean, Montessori's essential view, though, is that, there are developmental stages where things are more sensitive
Hmm.
to, where children, young babies and toddlers learn language in
Right.
a way that we don't as adults. And so it's not that you can't ever learn a language later on, but it's going to be harder. It's going to take more effort. It might
Yeah.
take different methods. And so it's part of the reason why she wants to focus so much on early childhood, on, developing these things when it is like really live in the child's development, because it is going to be harder later.
Yeah.
And so it's not a super encouraging message. Like if you missed out, if you're like me and you didn't develop the great fine motor skills and you're really clumsy, like there's really no way through but to work. And it's going to be harder work as an adult than it would have been if you had done it the first time. But it doesn't mean that there isn't hope, right? Like you can, like that is part of like the Montessori ethos, is
Yeah.
that you can learn and you can grow and you can change if you apply the effort.
Yeah. Now, this has been, I mean, I heard on, I mean, I follow Eric Weinstein on many podcasts, and he's talking about like learning disabilities versus teaching disabilities, where, people who are, let's say, high functioning, they are sort of like given ADD drugs and I don't know, a whole shebang. And it seems to me that the solution has been around since 1920. So why is it like, I'm asking you to speculate, but why is it not popular? Why is it not mainstream yet?
Yeah, we're trying. Um, Part of it, I mean, I don't know as much about the history, so I can't speak on it super, super clearly. But I mean, Montessori was here in America in the 1920s, and there was a huge popular movement. And my understanding is that she was essentially ousted by the progressives, and
Uh,
she had a really strong personality, very, you know, she could make a lot of enemies with her personality as well. And so by, the 1930s, 40s, she was essentially disappeared. And then, you know, decades go by, progressives are, kind of in the educational air for a long time. And then Montessori kind of has a grassroots resurgence in the 1950s, 1960s, where it's parents and mom and pop, teachers who are opening schools, and it's, starting to grow in particular areas in the country, in the US. And then today, I mean, we're seeing there's more growth, more interest, more awareness, especially, among parents. For example, on Instagram, the Montessori aesthetic is very live in people's minds. But
right.
we'll see where that goes in the future. I mean, I'd love to see Montessori become the norm
Yeah.
for education, but it's hard to predict what will happen.
Well, I wish you all the best for that. I mean, this is yeah, because this seems to be like the proper way, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, finally, so how do people get in touch with you if you are, and then where can they find you? You're on Substack.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, the best is Twitter. I'm underscore Samantha underscore Joy on Twitter, and I do things all the time on Montessori pedagogy, curriculum, education in general. And yeah, I'd love to connect with you there.
awesome. Thank you for your time, Samantha. Do you have any parting thoughts?
This has been great. Thank you so much for having me on and all your very perceptive questions. It's been a really great
Absolutely.
conversation.
Same here. Thank you very much. See you, folks.